You knew it was going to happen. So it's just, oh, you're blushing. It's cute. I got the, are you going to make me come up this year? I didn't, but I still got you a pencil. There you go. Hello, choir. I'm gonna have to get used to my turning again. Hello. All righty. Let me know if you've heard this one before. Dance like no one's watching, love like you've never been hurt, sing like nobody's listening. It's one of those pithy little sayings that kind of emerged out of an unknown place, but has become an easily thrown around phrase to encourage people to live boldly and without fear, to simply be who they are and enjoy life. Now, there's nothing wrong with this saying. In fact, I think it can be really helpful to remember that life should be free and fun and lived with passion, no matter how silly you look or sound, no matter what people think. But I'd like to add a little something to this phrase this morning. I'd like to make it dance like nobody's watching, love like you've never been hurt, sing like nobody's listening, and live like Jesus is actually in the room. There's so many places that we could go with our lessons this morning. We could talk about how nearly every church constitution quotes Matthew 18 to describe how we're supposed to deal with problems or issues when they crop up. But come on, it's the church. Those things never happen, right? So we're good. We could talk about how this seems to be Jesus being a forward thinker for what is coming for the disciples once he's gone. We could talk about how actually living into the bonds of Matthew 18 is uncomfortable and something that we don't always like doing. We could even track all the way back through our other lessons and talk about how God puts this massive responsibility on Ezekiel's shoulders, how the fate of a nation rests at his feet, and that if he doesn't tell these people God's message and they die, well, then that's Ezekiel's fault. So we could talk about how we're responsible for each other. We could talk about how Paul sums up this whole law business with one word: love. How love is at the heart of fulfilling every commandment in the Bible. So yeah, there's a lot we could talk about this morning, but of all of the verses that we have before us, I honestly only want to talk about one. Because in today's world, it seems like we need no other verse other than Matthew 18:20. We need it more than I could even adequately put into words. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. It's no small coincidence that Jesus ends his description of how the disciples are to deal with conflict in the future church with this promise of his presence. Because above all, Jesus knows people. He's witnessed firsthand how arguments about theology and worship and the interpretation of God's word can devolve into yelling and angst. He's seen how one person's sin against another can tear relationships apart. He knows how people work and how they react, and so he knows that when the time comes for the disciples to take over this whole shebang, it isn't going to be easy. There's going to be conflict. The people that they are leading are going to argue and bicker. They are going to fight and bicker and argue amongst themselves. After all, Jesus has just spent 3 years with these guys. He knows how they can push each other's buttons. And you can bet he just knows that somewhere along the line, Peter and John are going to argue about everything known to man, from who got to the tomb first, to who Jesus loved more, to what the resurrection means. And so he's trying to give them some guidance. But he's also trying to give them a bit of double-edged assurance that no matter what, even if he's gone, if there are 2 or more of them together, he's there. Now, I say that that's a double-edged assurance because while this promise is just that, a promise of comfort and hope, it's also a vital, not-to-be-forgotten reminder. Because if the disciples are to remember that Jesus is always with them, then that also means they're going to need to live and move and build the church and live together as though Jesus is always with them. Jesus is telling them that if he is with them always, well, then that means that they need to be living how he's taught them to live. So all of those arguments that are going to crop up, Peter and John's inevitable toe-to-toe ego matches, those decisions about their future, all of those things need to happen with the presence of mind to remember that Jesus is there. All of those things are going to need to play out with the remembrance that even though they can't see him, Jesus is in the room. Jesus knows that conflict is going to happen. And he knows that these disciples are not free from the influence of the world. He knows that the impulse is going to be there to want to be petty and to yell at each other and to storm out and to maybe even come to blows and to scream and yell. And he's trying to remind them, I'm there. How would I want you to live? Jesus is trying to tell them that when they want to fight how the world wants them to fight, they need to love. When they want to scream at each other, he called them to love. When they want to storm out and say, you know what, I'm done with you in this whole relationship, he reminds them to love. It isn't just a promise. It's a reminder of, hey, I might see how you're treating each other. You might want to remember what I taught you about living together. Let's be honest. We need this reminder, just like the disciples did, because most of the time, we aren't living like Jesus is in the room. We like to be assured that Jesus is with us, loving us, watching over us, listening when we need him to, but we don't always like to be reminded that if Jesus is with us, he's also probably calling us to live out our faith in a way that brings his kingdom to earth. We want Jesus to be with us, but we don't want him to always see and know what we're doing or how we're living, because then we might have to confront the fact that we aren't always living our faith through the lens of his love, through the lens of realizing that we, like Ezekiel, bear the responsibility one to another to care for each other and protect each other, to respect each other, and ultimately to strive to make sure that all are being able to live lives that God has called us into in complete fullness. We don't always want to live like Jesus is in the room, because that might mean that we have to put aside our misplaced anger and our ego and our prejudice and our fear and our judgment and actually get back to loving and living as God's children, living in a world filled with the rest of God's children. It's a bit of a heavy thing to carry, that weight that Jesus is in the room. But what that always cycles back to is that this, at its heart, while it is a reminder, is also a promise, an assurance, a word that we desperately need today more than ever. Because let's face it, there's no way around it. This world that we live in is a bit, for lack of a better word, crazy. I have talked to more people this week who are worried and fearful and feeling like they are on the brink of despair, and I can't say that I really blame them. We're in the midst of watching our country's coastlands be ravaged by storms with unprecedented fury. There are fires burning with reckless abandon in the west. It feels like there's this looming threat of war in random directions. We're all still so conflicted and divided on a myriad of issues that sometimes it's hard to just talk to someone without voices and blood pressures rising. And all of that doesn't even cover all of the personal stuff going on, the day-to-day stuff. Kids are back in school. Fall schedules are starting to pick up and go crazy. People are sick. Our lives are spinning in 100 directions, and wow, how do you even breathe in the midst of all of that? You breathe. You rise up, you continue on, because at its heart, today's gospel is an assurance and a never-ending promise that Jesus is in the room with you, never leaving your side, but always with you. It's not some trite, pithy saying. It is a gospel truth. Jesus is with you. And I don't just mean that in some collective you sense, but in a real, intimate, authentic, individual you sense. Jesus is here when things feel crazy and when they feel calm, when you're worried and when you've got things under control. Jesus is in the room, always. You are never left alone to fend for yourself amidst the chaos of the world and life in general. You are not alone. I could repeat it ad nauseum and it still wouldn't be enough. So you know what? Let's do something about that. If you have your phones, get them out. And if you don't have your phones, grab a piece of paper and a pencil. If you have your phone, I want you to open up your calendar. What I want you to do is set a reminder, and not just a one-time thing, a daily reminder. Set it for whatever time of day it is that you feel most stressed, whether it's right when you wake up in the morning, whether it's in the afternoon, whether it's in the evening once you've got home, whenever it is, set that daily reminder to say this: Jesus is in the room. If you have a piece of paper, write that exact same thing down. Jesus is in the room. And I want you to take that piece of paper home, stick it on your bathroom mirror, put it on your bedside table, use it as your bookmark, whatever you need to do to make sure that you see that every single day. We never cease to need this reminder, to remember that we aren't alone, and to remember that we need to live like Jesus is right there with us. It never gets old, that reminder. And the need never goes away to remember that Jesus is always there. So hear it one more time. Jesus is here. You're not alone. And because of that promise, guess what that means? If Jesus is here, then that means that you can dance like nobody's watching. You can love like you've never been hurt. You can sing like nobody's listening. And you can get around to living like Jesus is in the room. Amen.